Now I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the course schedule and overview what we're going to be talking about. And this can be helpful if you want to decide to pick and choose or cherry pick which materials you want to fill in the gaps of your knowledge or which are the most interesting. But other than that, if you're new, I just recommend going through the order that we have, because the order that I've constructed, I've kind of spent a lot of years thinking about it, and I've kind of come to this order by introducing certain topics, revisiting some of them, and I'm, of course, making sure it lines up with when the projects are due and what knowledge you want to have by what time. Because the best way to learn music production is to do it, is to make music. You have to be doing these assignments. The people that don't do the assignments fail the course. If you're taking the course in person, you're going to fail if you don't do the assignments. So do the assignments, and hopefully the videos are helpful too. I've designed them to be helpful as well. So, of course, this week is going to be the course overview, where we talk about what the course is and how it's laid out. Then we get into sort of what do you need to produce music? What are the technological things you need? What's the sort of mindset type of ideas you need to have in your head to produce music, and talking a little bit about that, because that can have a huge impact down the road, and making sure that people are prepared. And that's also when we kind of give people who are taking the course in person, you guys get your site licensing for Studio One. Then we're going to talk about navigating your digital audio workstation. Studio One is going to be what we use for examples, but where can you find things in the menus? How can we just basically set ourselves up for understanding the interface for producing music, which sets the stage for later when we're actually going to be using it to do the assignments. Then the next week, what we're going to do, we're going to take a step back and talk about sound and how does sound work, how is sound stored in a computer, and what are the properties of sound. And understanding that will come back later when we talk about sound design and also mixing and mastering, because we're producing music. What we're doing is manipulating and creating sound, so it's important to understand how sound works from a physical and an electronic level. Then the next week, we're going to go back to our digital audio workstation, and we're going to talk about signal flow. So this is things like routing. How do we add effects? How do we kind of create our song or compose a song in our digital audio workstation, and kind of creating that pathway from your brain to your computer or to the mixing console, so that you're able to get your ideas out there as efficiently and most inspirationally as possible. After that, we'll start talking about sound design and synthesizers, and then we'll move into effects. So the idea behind sound design is we want to prep people for that sound design project that's coming up. So how to use a synthesizer, what is an oscillator, what is a filter, what do all these controls do? And then, of course, effects, which are effects that you would add on top of either sound that's generated from a synthesizer or existing audio tracks. So things like reverbs, compressors, equalization, when to use them, what are the best practices around them, and how can we get a full mix? Then we'll talk about mixing and mastering the week after that, and I kind of tend to talk about those in about the same time, because there's a kind of two schools of thought. There's a traditional school of thought that sees mixing and mastering as two separate processes, and more now we're seeing some people, especially in hip-hop and EDM, kind of seeing the two together, because you kind of almost need to be mastering or thinking about mastering along the way to get that full produced sound that some people are looking for. So we'll also be talking a little bit more about dynamic range and some things like that that are just helpful for getting your tracks to sound as polished and complete as possible. And that'll also be the week that the sound design or synthesis project is due. Then the next week, we'll start talking about music theory. What are chords? What are some chord progressions? What are some general guidelines we can use when creating a chord progression? And kind of going from there, just trying our best to give a good introduction to music theory. There are a couple cool tools that I recommend using that can really jumpstart you, because obviously there's no way we can cover all of music theory within a week, but hopefully giving some examples and some tools that'll help you get on your way to understanding music theory without having to get too technical about it. Although music theory is the one thing outside of this course that would probably help you the most in terms of becoming a producer, more than anything else. So can't recommend that enough, reading about it and learning about it. After that, we'll go back into sound. Now that we've kind of seen sound, we've seen sound design, and we've seen music, we'll talk about digital audio and MIDI. We won't get too technical about MIDI, but understanding digital audio, this is where we're really going to dive into the nitty-gritty: sampling rate, quantization, bit rate. What's the difference between a wave and an MP3 file? Why would you want to send one versus another to a label or something like that? And this kind of goes back to our look at effects. How do these effects, are they related to things like bit rate and sample rate? And how can we control them to get really unique effects when we're creating our music? Then after that, we'll talk about live performance and DJing. So how could you perform your music live, whether you're a musician that plays an instrument, or you're a DJ, or you're kind of doing something in between, like using something like Ableton Live or one of these clip-based solutions. We'll also talk a little bit more about that. And that's when Project 2, which is the mixing and mastering project, will be due. After that, we'll talk a little bit about formal structure, and this is that idea of how do we take our 8-bar loop that we've created using the basics of music theory, maybe even sound design and mixing, and taking that 8-bar loop or that motif and transitioning it into an entire song. And how do we make our song interesting so we can go from an idea to a complete 4 or 5 minute, 10-minute track. So that's what we mean by formal structure. It's just kind of arrangement and building up ideas and introducing new motifs to just keep things interesting and keep the listener engaged. And then, of course, we'll talk about how to keep learning, and that's when the final project's going to be due. So how do we keep learning music production, music technology? Where do you keep going? What are some good resources, websites, and books and communities to keep going? And at that point, we may also talk a little bit about the history of music production as well, and really important instruments and synthesizers and things like that that were instrumental, no pun intended, to the creation of the way modern music is created with computers and such. And that's kind of an optional module that when I'm teaching this course in person, usually this collides with the event at Rice called Beer Bike. So not a lot of people show up that week. So that's usually when I would have that in. Those are kind of optional readings. And there'll be optional videos in each section that are just kind of there to expand your knowledge, but they're not completely necessary for understanding the material. They're just more extensions that are interesting. And I do recommend you watch them. But if you're just trying to get from 0 to 60 and as quick as possible, you can always come back and watch them later. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. Really excited to have you in the course, and hopefully you learn a lot and ask a bunch of questions. But once again, the best way to learn it is just to do it. So keep making music, keep writing music, and don't forget to join the Discord. See you guys in the next video.